Well, how are you this glorious Wednesday? I'm so glad you've joined me for today's video devotion, or if you're listening to the podcast, thank you so much. Today we are in the book of Judges, chapter 1. Now, if that caught you off guard, yes, we did skip the book of Joshua. We finished Deuteronomy, and we've jumped to Judges. The reason is last year in our Bible reading plan, we read Joshua. So today we are in Judges chapter 1. And you need to think of Judges chapters 1 and 2 as two different introductions to the book of Judges. With Judges 1 being from the historical military perspective as the people would have seen things. Judges 2 being from God's perspective, the spiritual perspective, and how he saw things. So today we're in chapter 1, and what I wrote at the top of my journal after having read this chapter is that what looks like obedience is not always actually obedience. Or what looks like obedience sometimes is just partial obedience, which means it's actually disobedience. In Judges 1, we get a recounting of some of the military victories as the Jewish people settled and conquered the promised land. And you get kind of an overview of that. But what stands out when you read the chapter is that even though they had many military victories and conquered most of the land, they did not capture all of it. And there were some places where they captured the land, but they did not drive the inhabitants or the citizens of that land out. They allowed them to continue living there, often making them part of forced labor, a form of slavery, if you will. And you see this mentioned, for instance, in verse 4, you have them winning a military victory completely. Same thing in verse 8. But when you look at verse 21, for example, the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this very day, the day that the book of Judges was actually written. Look at verses 27 and 28. But Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshean and its villages, and then some other places there, or the inhabitants of a couple of villages there. And at the end of verse 27, so the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. So they didn't conquer all of it when they first went into the promised land. But in verse 28, it came about when Israel became stronger. As the tribe and nation got stronger, they conquered those territories of the Canaanites, but they didn't drive them out. They turned them into forced labor, he says in verse 28, but they did not drive them out completely. Look at verse 29. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. They didn't even make them forced labor. They just let them stay there. Verse 30, similar type thing. Verses 31, 32, 33. So you had this history of they conquered most of the land, but not all of it. And then when they did conquer it, they did not always drive the people from there. Now, the book of Judges makes very clear that was a serious mistake. And there would be consequences throughout Israel's history because of what you read here in Judges 1 of them not driving all the inhabitants out when they conquered the promised land. Now, when you read the chapter, if you're just focusing on military success, they were very successful. They conquered most of the land. It looks like success and obedience. And in ancient times, turning the people they conquered into forced labor was a very common practice all over the world, actually. But yet it's not what God had told them to do. Back in Numbers chapter 33, at verses 51 and following, here's what God had told Moses to tell the people to do when they entered the promised land. Numbers 33, if you want to look it up, verses 51 and following. He said, speak to the sons of Israel. This is God telling Moses. Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Destroy all their figured stones and destroy all their molten images and demolish all their high places, the places and the instruments of their pagan idol worship. Destroy it all. Don't keep any of it. Get rid of all of it. Verse 53, and you shall take possession of the land and live in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. And you shall inherit the land, in verse 54, by lot, etc. How they divided the land up among the families, the different tribes. Verse 55, but if you do not drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as pricks in your eyes and as thorns in your sides, and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And notice this, God says, as I planned to do to them, God was going to defeat them and give victory to Israel and drive the inhabitants out. God says, just as I planned to do to them, so I will do to you if you don't drive them all out, as I tell you. If you disobey me, the day will come, not only when they will be a thorn in your side and create problems for you, but the day will come that I will judge you and discipline you and punish you, Jewish people, by driving you out of the promised land. And that actually happened. Now, the book of Judges tells the story of after the time of Joshua and the elders of Joshua's day, of the people actually being influenced by the inhabitants they allowed to remain in the promised land, worshiping their idols, committing spiritual adultery, if you will, on God, their God, and God judging them. That's the story of the book of Judges. And you'll notice that there's a pattern. We'll talk about it more tomorrow as we go through this book. But here's what I want you to see. When you read Judges 1, and you say, yeah, well, they didn't drive everybody out, but they won all these battles and they conquered all this land and they turned all these people into forced labor. What looks like success is not always success. What looks like obedience is not always obedience. They obeyed God partially. They experienced partial success, but in God's economy, partial is failure. They sinned, and they would pay for it. And so I started asking a question of myself. Are there things in my life that I know very clearly God has told me to do or not do, and I'm only partially obeying Him? That's a good question for you to ask and answer in your own life. Are there things that you know God's very clearly saying, do this, don't do that, and you're obeying Him, but only partially? Which means it's actually disobedience. And how's that showing up in your life? If not today, how might it show up down the road? What looks like obedience is not always obedience. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at Judges chapter 2.